Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. This is amazing. I am Courtney Galligan, and together with Jennifer Marisi, I am one of the co-chairs of the Middlesex Middle School Parent Association. We are beyond thrilled to be hosting this evening's event, along with the Thriving Youth Task Force, the Darien High School Parent Association, and the YWCA. In a few moments, two amazing women and mothers will be taking the stage. Dr. Lisa Damour is the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, Untangled, Under Pressure, and her newest book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. I think we all have teenagers because that's why we're all here. She co-hosts the Ask Lisa podcast and works in collaboration with UNICEF. Lisa is recognized as a thought leader by the American Psychological Association. Reena Ninan is an entrepreneur and journalist. She has spent 2 decades as a TV anchor and correspondent for ABC, CBS, and Fox News. In 2020, she created a media company, Good Trouble Productions, focused on content with purpose. Together, Reena and Lisa launched Ask Lisa, the Psychology of Parenting podcast in June of 2020. It is now the #2 parenting podcast on Apple Podcasts. It is also very fun to know that half of the Ask Lisa podcasts are recorded right here in Darien. Reena is a Darien resident and a parent of students at Middlesex Middle School and Tokenique Elementary School. And we are so grateful to Lisa for choosing to be in Darien tonight as she wraps up the final weeks of her book tour. We also want to say a sincere thank you to Lisa for so generously requesting that the proceeds raised during our VIP reception earlier this evening be donated back to mental health programming at Middlesex Middle School in recognition of this moment of heightened mental health awareness in the Darien school community. Thank you all for showing up tonight, and please join us in warmly welcoming Reena and Lisa.
You made it! I'm so happy to be here. Or as my friends say, I made it somehow. I'm the person who just can't get it together sometimes, which is why I think our podcast works. I am so grateful, as everyone here in the house is, that you could join us today. And you actually have connections to Darien.
I do. So first of all, let me just say thank you to all of you for being here and for the organizers for making this happen. My mom graduated from this high school. Yeah. She was the class of 1961, and I actually used to spend a chunk of every summer in Darien with my grandmother, who lived on Heather Lane. She was a caterer in town, and the big outing was to go to the Pepperidge Farm outlet. Do you remember that? We buy those little rye bread squares and turn them into hors d'oeuvres. So I have very specific and fond memories of my time in Darien.
Speaking of your mom, we have a little surprise for you.
What?
Yes. If we can just open this up, thank you so much.
What do we have?
I was able to find your mother's yearbook photo from Darien High School. If I can get it to work. Jeff?
Let's see if we can do it. Oh, that is too fun. That is
We were able to dig up. This
Well,
is,
that's me.
of course, you.
Yeah.
That is not her mom from back in the day. This is the cover of Back in the Day,
That is Sue Bellamore. There's my mom.
1961.
Yep.
Oh, and it even has her name at the bottom there.
Yep.
Okay, there they are.
Yes, so my mom's an identical twin. I don't actually, in this photo, I don't know which one is my mother, actually. It's her and her twin sister.
The twin sister, so that was in the yearbook, and, oh, I just hit the wrong button.
Yeah.
Oh no, Jeff, there was, oops.
It's
All right.
okay. It's okay.
Well, it was, the other part was, poor Jeff. Jeff, I told you, I'm a hot mess.
Yeah.
Proving my point live
Yeah.
in front of a studio audience. Well, that was the photo from the yearbook.
That's Megan.
And Oh, that was it. Okay. It was the caption, which you probably couldn't have read, but it was so cool to see. And we love that you have roots here. A lot of people obviously want to talk about your book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. I hope you all have had a chance to read it or look at it. There's so much in there, Lisa, but I think you really changed the conversation on what mental health should look like, and particularly looking at the wellness industry. Tell me a little bit about how you define it and what your take is.
So that was really probably the main reason I wrote this book, is that the way we talk about mental health, which we're talking about all the time now, it's important that we're talking about it, but the way we talk about it is actually not as accurate as I wish it were. So often in the culture, the conversation around mental health equates being mentally healthy with feeling good or calm or relaxed or at ease. And these are all good things, like psychologists want that for people, but it's not how we assess mental health. And I think it actually sets a high bar that can leave people feeling like they're not able to achieve it. As psychologists, the way that we understand mental health is that it's really about two things. It's about having feelings that fit the context and then managing the feeling well. So, if your kid gets, the news that their best friend is moving away, we fully expect your kid will be sad, upset, worried about who they're going to hang out with. Those are all distressing emotions. Those are all evidence of mental health. And what we're really interested in is, how does the kid handle it?
I want to give you guys also a sense about how the night will run. We're going to have a conversation, Lisa and I, and then probably about 30 or 40 minutes into it, we're going to open it up to questions. And I just want you to see, we've got mics on either end. So if you've got a burning question, feel free to start lining up about 30 minutes after. And we just want to let everyone know tonight's live event is going to be recorded and posted on social media. So please do keep that in mind when you're asking questions. As we know, it's not a one-on-one therapy session, as sometimes I imagine might happen at your live events. So if you could keep the questions generic. But Lisa, we had some questions submitted in advance, and one of them, a parent asked, what are some effective strategies for parents to help their preteens build resilience and cope with stress? Is it me, or does it feel like it's more stressful to be a teen than ever before?
I think it is more stressful to be a teen. And when I think about why it's more stressful, I often think about it in terms of input and output, that our teens are taking in so much. The world is more complex, and then they have access to the world through digital technology in a way that we ourselves did not, that we could be more naive, we could take much more breaks from it. And then we ask a lot more of kids. The demands on them, the expectations are higher than they've ever been. So I do think it's a very stressful time to be a teenager or a tween, which also then means it's a very stressful time to be raising tweens and teens.
So how do you recognize anxiety and depression in our tweens and teens?
That is such a tricky question, right? Because I've already sort of, said that we expect distress, we expect to see kids having a hard time sometimes. And certainly in adolescence, typical teenage mood is all over the map. A typically developing teenager will have 5 intense moods before 9 a.m., right? So it can be very hard to know, when is it time to worry, right? If this is what it looks like before breakfast, when do we worry? And so the way I want people to think about it is, we worry if mood goes to a concerning place and stays there. So we expect teenagers to be sad. We expect them to sometimes be nervous. We do not expect to see teenagers become sad day over day, or tense day over day, or just even numb over a long period of time. So if mood lasts in a worrisome place, that's concerning. And then the other thing I want us to be on the lookout for is what I call costly coping. So they're coping with emotions, but they're doing it in a way that comes at a cost. So, obviously things like abusing substances, but it also might be, being hard on the people around them all the time, or being hard on themselves.
Someone's asking, I recognize that kids have individual differences, but if you had to pick one or two, what are your favorite tried and true skills for kids to regulate emotion?
So this is what it's all about, regulating emotion. We can't prevent distress. We can't magically make it go away as much as we want to. And I have 2 teenagers myself, so I know that when they're very upset, that we have such a strong impulse as parents to just want to fix it, want to make it stop. But what we do is we help kids regulate. And there are all of these fantastic ways that kids do regulate emotion and that we can support it. But the way they regulate is sometimes different than the way adults do. So the kinds of things I hear a lot from kids are things like they've had a really hard day and they want to come home and cuddle with the dog. Like that's a big part of how kids help themselves feel better. Teenagers often get their feelings out, as they will say, by listening to music. It's very common. If you ask teenagers, most of them have a sad playlist. Most of them have an angry playlist. I was with a pack of teenagers and I was asking for other negative playlists they have. And one junior high school boy was like, I have a playlist called Devious, what is it? It was like Devious Licks or something like that. And I was like, what's that for? He's like, when I'm feeling a little malicious, but I don't want to act on it. He's like very funny.
So what are the songs?
I know, I was like, I need to know what's on this playlist. So it's common for teenagers to, if they're sad, they'll go put on their sad playlist and they'll cry alongside it. Psychologists actually like crying. It calms the central nervous system. It helps them to be, to feel better. Sometimes kids are gonna wanna talk, but I think we really need to appreciate they use a huge range of healthy coping that does not necessarily coming to us and saying, I wanna talk about how I'm feeling.
So there are different ways that they approach it that you just sort of need to know. One of my favorite things I love about your book is when you talk in the gender chapter about dads and the research on what dads can do. Especially, I guess the question for me is, how do you get boys to talk, right?
Yeah.
I feel like they go through a phase and they don't want to talk to you, is what I hear from a lot of people.
I think that's pretty common. So, there are some teenagers who really do want to talk about their feelings. What we know from the research is that they're more likely to be our daughters, that as a culture, we're much better at socializing girls to talk about their emotions than boys. And this is something that's a problem because talking about feelings is a really effective way to get relief for emotional distress. So, you learn a lot when you write a book. And I would say one of the biggest revelations to me in working on this book is to really come to appreciate that boys, who are consolidating a masculine identity, often around 5th or 6th grade, they can pretty quickly come to the conclusion that talking about feelings is a girl thing to do. That girls express and boys are tough and invulnerable. And then, Rena, one of the things that I found in the literature is it's so often in family life, if it's a 2-parent heterosexual household, it's the mom who's initiating conversations about feelings, asking the boy about his mood. And it's so well-meaning, but what I really came to appreciate is it can sometimes backfire, because if it's only the mom who's raising questions about mood and feeling, it can actually prove the boy's point. Like, see, it's a girl thing, right? It's only mom who's bringing it up. And so one thing that became very clear to me as I was working on this book is that if we really want boys to talk about their feelings, it's critically important that the men in their life, their dads, their coaches, their teachers, their uncles, family friends, step in there and talk with boys about their own emotions, but actually ask boys about their feelings too. And I gotta tell you, I think as long as talking about feelings is like women's work, we're not gonna get boys talking about their emotions.
Wow, that's incredible to hear you say that. I had never really looked at it in that perspective until I read that in your book. I want to talk a little bit about social media. The American Psychological Association just put out a new advisory, right? Yesterday, today, recently?
Yeah, just in the last 24 hours.
In the last
or so.
24 hours. Tell me a little bit about that.
So, social media is a huge topic. It gets a lot of headlines. I will tell you there's been a bit of a debate in the field about how we want to think about it. There are some folks who are like, it's terrible for kids, you should be very, very worried about it. There are other folks in the field who are like, we can't say that, we don't really have the data for that, we don't really know. And I've sort of been like, I don't know that either of those positions is actually all that helpful to parents. And so I was really pleased. The American Psychological Association just put out this advisory, and it's, you can find it on their website. If you follow me on Twitter, I put it up yesterday. What I like about this advisory is that it homes in on a few things that we need to talk about. So one is problematic use, right? And that's the challenge with social media, is that I don't think there's a kid on the planet for whom it's not simultaneously positive and wonderful at times, and then difficult and negative at times. And so this advisory really focuses on problematic use, and that can be use that gets in the way of things that kids need for healthy development, like sleep and physical activity and in-person interaction. It can be when what they're looking at online, and we've done podcasts on this, is worrisome or does not line up with the values that we want our kids to hold. It can be when kids are using their online environments to actually extend negative social interactions, which can happen. And the other thing I really like about this advisory is that it talks about how you'll have different rules at different ages for kids. That when I think about the current conversation, there are things that really get collapsed. So like social media gets collapsed when in fact it's a really complex thing. Teenager gets collapsed. 12, 13, 14-year-olds on social media is really different than 16, 17, 18-year-olds on social media. And so this advisory talks through like how to think about supervision and rules over time. And one of my favorite points in the advisory that I think is so critical is, they don't say it this way, but I basically read it as like, you got to know your kid. And I will say as a clinician, there have been times when I've advised families to make different rules for different children in the same family based on how well they handle themselves online, how impulsive they are, how mature they are. So it's complex. And I think that may be sometimes why there's not so much nuance in the media about it, because the media does well with sound bites and simple things. But I feel like the APA just did a really good job of laying out the kinds of things that we want to think about and talk about at home.
Especially in light of us emerging out of this pandemic, how do you think social media is affecting our teens?
Well, one thing I really feel very strongly about is, thank goodness at some level they had it in the pandemic.
Really?
Yeah.
You surprise me sometimes in the things that come out of your mouth, I have to say.
I know.
You really do.
I
Because
know.
one episode, she's like, a mom writes in heartbroken that a kid had done something and like, what should I do now? And she's like, he's got to move schools. We can't tell the mom he's got to move schools. No, here's why. And the whole podcast, you walk us through why this is actually a situation where you need to change a school.
Probably sometimes time to start over.
Yeah.
No, but I do think about Rena. I mean, can you imagine if the pandemic had happened when we were teenagers and you couldn't go out and you couldn't see your friends and you didn't have a meaningful way, or you're fighting for the one landline the family had? That's what would have happened,
Back in the
right?
day.
It would have been back in the day. And so at some level, I'm so grateful that they had a way to stay connected. But obviously kids spend a ton of time online, and their worlds became very narrow. And then, of course, with the algorithms that drive social media, which are basically these giant equations that dictate what shows up in any of our feeds, the algorithms actually start to shape very specific and individual social media experiences. If you use social media, you've had this happen, right? Where you like something or look at something, and then suddenly you get a whole bunch of that, right? So you were getting salads for a while.
Salads, because I've talked about in the podcast, my salad club is here, that we do salads. Everyone does one salad a day. And I was looking at all the New York Times salads, and so I was getting lots of salad.
And so then you get that. So I have been in an adorable children dancing mood for phase on my Instagram, which I do like looking at, but I'm now getting tons of. What was worrisome in the pandemic is that some kids were finding themselves in social media environments that were not healthy at all. So, a lot of kids in the pandemic, kids of all genders, thought like, I'll get fit, I'll use this time to improve myself. And so they started looking for or searching, or liking or looking at length, videos about fitness or weight loss. And what we saw is that their feeds were just flooded with that kind of content. And the way I think about this, and we've talked about this on the podcast, teenagers are vulnerable to norms. They're highly aware of the norms wherever they are. And they're more vulnerable than little kids are, and they're more vulnerable than adults are. So we saw this huge explosion of eating disorders in the pandemic. And I think part of what caused that, and of course we can't prove this, but you've been at this long enough and you hear enough stories. I think if you spend all day looking at ultra fit, ultra thin bodies, and you're also not going to school and looking at healthy, wide range of bodies in 3D, you can start to think, this is what people look like, this is what I should look like. So when I worry about social media, I worry about it getting in the way of kids' sleep. Sleep is essential for mental health. And I worry about kids finding themselves in environments that shape their behavior in the real world in ways that we don't want to see. And then, of course, for kids who are having a hard time socially online, I worry about that too.
What I love about you also is you're not a no social media, no. You believe it's part of society. We've got to work with it. But where do you draw the line? Like, you believe no technology ever in the bedroom, right?
Ideally, yeah.
Right? And should we be checking iPhone messages, Instagram? Like, what is a proper hygiene for teen iPhone use?
This is tough, right? I mean, in terms of how much you should monitor. So what I will say, everything I'm about to say is a heck of a lot easier if your kid is not well underway with their social media life. Like, I always feel sort of ambivalent about, like, here's the ideal. And I think, tons of parents, myself included, are like, yeah, that sounds great. Like, that ship has sailed. But for those of you who have not yet given your kid a phone, and then we can think about how to walk this back. First thing I would say is go incredibly slow. That when kids are asking for a phone, and it's different in different communities when this occurs, I promise you, they will agree to anything to get that phone.
get the phone.
They
It's
really
true.
will. They really will. So this is like your moment.
Yeah.
And so that's when you say, okay, you can have, whatever version of a phone you're giving them. It does not go in your bedroom. Ideally, I would say in the 24-hour day, it does not go in the bedroom, and certainly not overnight. I will be monitoring it. I'll keep an eye on it. Also, you can usually start kids with no browser and no social media apps. Mostly what they need is to be able to text with their peers. And the way I think about it, Rena, is, social media can be very problematic. Social isolation is not good for kids either. And so what we're looking for is sort of where's the inflection point? Like, how much digital technology do they need to stay connected to the kids in their world and to have meaningful social connections? So a lot of kids can do well on text for a long time. And again, what I said about, different ages on social media look very different. So the later you can push it, the better. What I will tell you is that you should keep an eye on how your kid is doing with texting. If your kid ends up in the meanest text thread ever, they probably are not ready for a social media app, right? I mean, you'll kind of watch and know your kid and go slowly. And then add as necessary for them to just maintain their real world relationship.
But I feel like the texting thing, like, how do you have a conversation about etiquette, particularly about the mean girl thing, right? Because usually you deal with the texting when there is a massive blowout that everybody in the community has now been involved in, right?
Yes.
And what do you do at that point,
It
right?
happens a lot.
It does, right?
It does happen a lot.
If you could advise parents on, here are the rules of etiquette, here is what you really should do, and the conversation you should have with your kids, what would you say?
So you mentioned mean girl, and girls can be really hard on one another, boys can be really hard on one another. We actually, when we see the data on who actually is less kind, it's not clear that one gender's outpacing another, not that this is a competition that we should even be considering, right? But I think that there's a few ways to slice this. One is, our kids are not gonna like everyone in their world. Like, that's fine. Like, of course they're not. Like, they did not choose everyone they go to school with. They spend all day every day with everyone. And so I think at home, if we can make space of, like, well, of course there's gonna be kids who rub you the wrong way. And of course there's gonna be kids who you find annoying. And if you, in the privacy of our home, wanna talk to me about how frustrating they are, that's fine. I think it's so important that we help kids understand where you say what. And this is sort of corny, but I love it. You know that there's that saying, like, dance like nobody's watching, email like you're gonna be subpoenaed. Like, I think that's a good rule. And I think, like, email/text like you're gonna be subpoenaed. And Rena, you and I know that as, like, hopefully pretty commonsensical adults, if you need to have a conversation that you actually would never want to show up elsewhere in the world, you call the person, right? Yeah. That you're like, give me a call. Yeah. And then you say what you gotta say. So I think what's really important is we need to make clear to kids, it's not that we expect you to have, no negativity, that it all be lily white in your world, like in terms of your soul and your heart and your mind. Like, no, people are gonna rub you the wrong way. You're gonna need to have delicate conversations. That's not something you do in a written form anywhere ever. And we as functioning adults, if we need to have a delicate conversation, you don't do it over text. And so I think making that distinction and showing kids that's actually the kind of thing that wise grown-ups do is part of how you do that. But I think we need to acknowledge that kids are not always going to like everyone, and we need to give them ways to vent about it a little bit in safe and appropriate ways that don't then cause more trouble and hurt people.
Yeah. I want to move on. I want to talk a little bit about competitive sports and college admissions. I want to start with the sports because, as we know, mental health issues are on the rise. Sports, and everybody hears me out here in Darien, is so competitive. You have to be on Olympic level by the time you're in the 6th grade almost. And what's funny is one of our other episodes, we had Lauren Regula. She's 42?
She's 42. She's a 3-time Olympian.
3-time Olympian, and we did a podcast. I said, so what do you do for your kids? She never puts them in club sports.
Yeah.
The travel team, she never puts them in the travel team. She says it is too much unnecessary pressure. They're still going to get the great workouts. They're still going to have the opportunity to deal with the great coaches. But you remove that pressure, they're able to rise in such a different way. And she's no 3-time Olympic athlete in her 40s. I was shocked by that. But one of the questions we got is the emphasis on athletics. And there's so little options for high schoolers who want to play sports but might not be the best. Are we valuing athleticism over other things that might matter?
It happens in a lot of communities. So if it's happening here, Darien's not alone by any means. And it's too bad, in a way that kids kind of can't mess around with a sport or just go out because it's fun. And I hope that there may be ways that we can make that increasingly available. There are a couple things that actually are troublesome here. One is actually, if you talk to athletic trainers, they are the first to say that they're not a big fan of early and often specialization, that the developing bodies of kids actually need a lot more diversity in terms of how they're exercising and more rest. And it also means that sometimes kids aren't just having the kind of the value of sports both as a character building thing and a social thing and a fun thing. I think there may be ways to help kids either through your lovely neighborhoods or communities have more easygoing versions of sport. And one of the things we know from the research is that especially as high schoolers get into pretty stressful demands, just working out for the sake of working out is one of the ways that kids actually get some relief and some leisure, girls in particular. So, creating conditions where going for a run is just a fun thing to do for its own sake actually can make a big, big difference.
I just want to say that the Darien team could take you in Ohio. You guys in Ohio. In football, in lacrosse.
I don't know. Ohio is pretty hardcore. It's kind of unbelievable.
I'm saying that jokingly because Lisa's husband is actually a soccer coach, right?
He is a soccer coach. He is a soccer coach of a high school team that's really good. Really good. Really good. They're often number 1 in the country, and it's a lot. It's a lot. They operate a lot like a college team, and it's a really mixed thing.
It is. Yeah. It's a lot of pressure. Just looking at the time, I'm gonna take one more question, and then we're gonna ask people if you have a question, feel free to line up, and we will take your question. Okay. I almost feel like, why are we sending kids to college anymore? That is the point that I have reached. The price tag, but obviously I'm talking about how incredibly competitive. And I know kids that graduated from Darien High School, top of their class, did everything. You name it, they did it, from sports to whatever extracurricular things, and they're good kids. Yeah. And many of them didn't make their top 10 schools. Yeah. This is nuts. It's bonkers.
It's bonkers if we focus on 20 schools only. And I think that that's a place where we often find ourselves now. And the thing that has made this bonkers, that is very easily accessible in terms of just finding these data, but not actually widely known, is how dramatically the admissions rates have changed since we were applying to college. So I have a daughter who's a freshman in college, and I went to Yale. I started there in the fall of 1988. The admission rate when I was allowed into Yale was 20%. Right? You could almost hit it randomly. You really could. You have a 1 in 5 chance of getting in by accident into Yale.
I didn't feel that way when I applied, except a little bit later after that. But yeah.
The admission rate now is 6%.
Wow.
Stanford leads the pack. They used to be, actually in the mid-70s, Stanford's admission rate was 31%. It is currently 4%. So it's really important that we understand.
Why is it? It just.
Oh, there's interesting things. I mean, one of the things is that schools now cultivate a great number of applicants, that the whole US News and World Report and how you get high ranking is you turn down tons of kids. And so the more kids you get to apply, there's all that. I think this testing optional thing is going to be a game changer, is going to change it a lot. So here's actually how I approached this with my daughter when she was applying to colleges. I said, look, you are way better than I ever was in high school. I know what I did. I know my scores. I know everything. I was like, if you want to apply to Yale, you can apply to Yale. And then go buy yourself a lottery ticket down at the drugstore. It's kind of the same thing, right? And I think as long as we set it up that way, you can do that. And I think it's really important that we understand that the landscape is not what it was for these competitive schools. And if you really think about it, it means that Stanford is turning down 96% of the kids who apply.
Wow.
And I am sure a full 95% of those kids are fully qualified to be there. Okay, so we just need to that is the reality. Okay, this is not in my mind a crisis. The wonderful thing about living in the US is we have college upon college upon college, right? I mean, I live in Ohio. We have Denison, Kenyon, Oberlin, Ohio Wesleyan. I mean, just in my little neck of the woods, there are just beautiful schools, one after another, where kids can actually go, right? I mean, kids can expect to get in if they do a good job in high school. I mean, so if we move off of the 15 schools right now that are just they are just statistically out of reach for anyone who has not cured cancer, right? I mean, I think if we just say that,
Yeah.
it's fine.
Yeah.
It's only a problem if we or our kids attach ourselves to these institutions.
So how should we be thinking for parents who have rising seniors, for people in middle school? How should we be approaching and preparing that college conversation?
I think we have to mean it when we say what we're interested in is fit.
Fit.
Yeah, finding a school that fits you. And I think we have to mean it. I think people say it, but they're like, and Harvard would be good, But I think we have to get past that and just say, okay, statistically, that's not where it's at anymore. And that is okay. And let me just tell a story just in terms of how I've really come to feel that this is something we can mean it when we say it. So I got my PhD at Michigan and I taught there. And Michigan's right now in those sort of very, very hard to get in schools. And I was in the psych department teaching, and we would have undergraduates who wanted to work in our psych labs and wanted to, do stuff. There are so many undergraduate psychology majors that you had to get in a huge line, and very, very few students actually got to work in labs. We moved to Shaker Heights, Ohio, and I took a job at John Carroll University, which is this lovely regional college, Jesuit school up the road from us, not a school that, is dazzling anybody's top lists.
Yeah.
The psych department is staffed by me, same person who was at Michigan, not that long ago, all these other people with PhDs just like mine. And any undergraduate who wanted to work in one of our labs could work in one of our labs. Wow. Every undergraduate who wanted to be writing research papers and publishing research papers with us could. And I was like, holy moly, right? Michigan's got this glorious psych department that you basically cannot access as an undergrad. And you come down to John Carroll and you're publishing papers with faculty. So in terms of the quality of the training we were able to give, what students had access to, that, I know it's very specific, but that made me really appreciate there's a lot of schools that can do incredible things for kids that we're not talking about.
Such a great point. And I think I should say the friends of mine whose kids recently graduated in the past 3 years, they've landed in the most amazing schools, the most amazing schools that are a perfect fit for them, and they're thriving.
Yeah.
But I think it's that mindset that I graduated from this school, so we've got to put you in that school, or it's Ivy League, and you should be aiming for Ivy League.
Yeah, it just doesn't work like that anymore. And I think if we can just say, okay,
Yeah.
then we can say, okay.
Okay. I'm going to do one more question, but we're going to open up to questions. So if you have a question, we've got mics on both ends of the aisle, and so please feel free to ask. We know a lot of people are interested. I want to ask you, This was a great question we got. Is there an average age when most teenagers stop pushing so hard against parents to individuate, if that's a verb, and instead approach the establishment of a separate identity with more calmness? What determines this? Good question. Great question.
Okay, so there's a section in this new book called Why Your Teen Can't Stand How You Chew. And I could have called that section like age 13. And I have to tell you, Rena, like there's things you learn in your theory classes as a psychologist. And I remember learning the theory of separation, individuation, which is kids want to be separate, they want to become their own people. Living this as a mother, I was like, oh my gosh, like nobody did justice to how actually severely unpleasant this experience is. And so what happens, Rena, right around 13, is that kids decide that they want to I call it in the book, I call it sort of build their own brand. Like they want to be their own person. And so what it means is if we do anything that is actually like the brand they see themselves establishing, they find it very annoying, right? So maybe you have forever liked Beyonce, and then suddenly your 13-year-old daughter decides she likes Beyonce, and now she's incredibly upset with you for liking Beyonce also, right? So that's a problem. But also, we're so intertwined still with kids when they're 12 and 13 that if we do something that doesn't match the brand they see themselves developing, that is also annoying, right? So oh my gosh, you're gonna wear that to the 8th grade orientation? I cannot be seen with you. This is so mortifying, right? Okay, so here's the deal. Anything we do that is like how they see themselves becoming is annoying. Anything we do that is unlike how they see themselves becoming is annoying. Everything we do is annoying, right? That is just this moment in developmental time. I can actually see who has 13-year-olds in this room. All right, so here's the super good news. They go to high school. High school lets kids start to specialize, develop interests, get into stuff that, we don't know anything about or that we don't do. And usually this settles down. Usually once kids have a sense of I have a freestanding brand, it's different from your brand, I'm into this stuff, you don't even do that stuff, they often ease up. They can tolerate us better. I will say, and this didn't make it into the book, and it's interesting, you write the book, it goes to the publisher, it's over, and then you keep having insights and awareness. It comes back when they're anxious about their brand. So,
Which is what age?
Well, it can be really a lot of points in development, but if you take your kid on a college tour,
yeah.
Right? And the other potential new classmates are there, oh my gosh, you are so embarrassing, right? They can't stand being with you. Because they're now thinking about, here comes my college identity.
Yeah.
And now I have an identity question, and now you're bothering me again, right? So what I would say, and honestly, this could be the headline for all things raising adolescents, it's not personal. It feels really personal.
Feels very personal.
It is not as personal as it feels. Not as personal as it feels.
Yeah. I think I scared everybody away saying we're filming tonight about questions. I've scared everybody.
We got some wonderful
people. Yes,
wonderful,
please. Yeah. We would love to hear from you. Yes, please. Hi.
Can you give some advice on how we can help our kids sort of reach their true potential, but not make it feel like undue pressure? Which is what I hear a lot, lay off, you're pressuring me. But, make sure that they're really pushing themselves and stretching their comfort zone and kind of growing in the experience of school.
Great. So how do you help kids reach their full potential without all the pressure? Did I get that right? Yeah.
That's okay. So part of how any one of us reaches our potential is we do things we care about, right? And we do things that we're invested in. And so, of course, it's easier then to thrive in the context of doing something that matters to you and that has meaning.
Yeah.
And I think that one thing that I am comfortable with, but that we have to acknowledge, is that school isn't going to feel like that for kids all the time, or certainly not every aspect of school. And one of the metaphors I introduce in this new book is this idea of school is like a buffet where we require kids to eat everything on the buffet. Right? As adults, we go to the buffet, we get what we like, we take it back to our table, we enjoy it. And with kids, we're okay, get it all, eat it all, right? How you feel about, whether you would have chosen this for yourself, we're not asking, right? But we do want you to engage it. And what I like about the food metaphor is that it takes away kind of character judgments when kids aren't into it, right? We don't give people a hard time about food preferences, right? Like if you don't like beets, you don't like beets. Like we don't make it about who you are as a person. Whereas I think sometimes in school, we're like, why don't you like math? You know, why don't you like this?
Yeah.
When we talk about it in more neutral terms of like, look, this may not be the thing you like right now, you may like it eventually, this is then about developing habits, because we all do need to be able to do things we don't feel like doing. Leave open the door, you may like this later. And then for the stuff they're interested in, like, do you want to find ways to get into this more? Do you know, like, enjoy it as much as you can? And so meeting one's potential, I think, comes later in the game when you have more choice and say. And I think that the more we neutralize the conversation about the fact that kids are not gonna want to do everything that we ask them to do in school, I think the better. And I think it actually then takes away pressure in ways that aren't helpful to kids and leaves open doors for things that are good.
Good question. Yes.
Hi, not a big question, but you brought it up when you were talking about text, about, we need to talk about it in person or on the phone. Having boys, they don't use the phone at all, ever. And they won't even want to order a pizza on the phone. So how do you kind of work that into their, like, knowing that one day they have to use the phone?
No, this is a really important question, actually. I remember learning how to use the phone by watching my mom use the phone, right? Do you remember, like, parents pick up the phone, how they answer, how they call?
My dad used to go, yellow, but like, yellow, yellow. It's like, Dad, what?
And so I think part of why kids don't use the phone so much is actually, they don't actually see us use the phone all that much, right? I mean, they just don't do that. And I will tell you, you're not alone. I have cared for lots of families where the parent is like, I need my son to make a haircut appointment for himself. And because there is no online way to do it, his hair is like 2 feet long, right? He won't do it. So, one of my favorite, I learned this in my training it was around toddlers and how they develop skills. And it was this phenomenal psychoanalyst who trained me named Erna Furman. And she's like, first we do stuff for kids, then we do stuff with kids, then we stand by and admire as they do it on their own, and then we let them go do their thing.
Or you cry in between that last stage.
Crying all the way.
One extra stage of that.
So I think that you can actually just, it's under the umbrella of things we have to teach kids how to do now. And I think be more deliberate. So you're like, all right, I'm going to make this haircut appointment for you. You stand there and watch me do it, right? Now I'm going to stand here while you do it next time. Now you know how to do it. But actually coaching them along, they're very anxious about it because they're just not used to doing it.
It's good to hear. It's good to hear. Next question over here.
Can you speak a little bit to households where you have siblings, or even in cases where there's friendships? So much of teenagers' identity is sort of how they bounce off these people. And as a parent, when you see something that's maybe happening with a friendship or a sibling, and they're struggling, like how do you be supportive, but also you see something that's not working? And can you speak a little bit to how to interject oneself in that scenario?
Coming up,
Yeah.
sibling episode.
Yeah, so we have some episodes about siblings. Actually, one that's coming out.
Coming up in 2 weeks, 3 weeks.
Yeah, it's very soon, about siblings being hard on each other, really hard on each other sometimes. But I think the thing that comes to mind in your question, it's really hard for kids when we criticize them. Kids are tender. And when we're giving them feedback that's hard, it's often quite painful for them. They love us, and it's hard for us to criticize them, even if we're right, even if they do need redirection. And one of the rules I really live by in caring for kids and teenagers, both clinically and in my own home, is that all kids, all teenagers have two sides. They have the part of them that just said that really rotten thing to their sister, and they have the part of them that really does not feel good about what they just said to their sister, right? Or they have the part of them that really wants to hang out with that kid who is very exciting and where they always get in trouble, and the part of them that doesn't feel comfortable with this. And so a way when you need to give kids feedback which we do, right? We're here to guide, we're here to help them grow, is to align yourself with the part of them that you actually knows what you know and knows what you're hoping that they'll have more, spend more time thinking about. And so to say, like, buddy, like, that's not like you to talk to your sister like that. What's going on? Right? And so talking to that side of the kid, or saying, I know, that kid is a lot of fun, but you and I both know you're getting in trouble a lot. Like, are you okay with that? Like, how are you feeling about that? But really trying to invite that much more, kind of mature and reflective side to the table. Because if you don't treat that like it's already in them, what you're going to get is a defensive reaction. If you're like, don't talk to your sister like that, well, she's really annoying, right? I mean, that's right away what you're going to get. So for me, the rule is you have to always assume that other side is there, even if it's hidden way behind a whole lot of behavior that you don't want to see right now. And you have to really believe that the side of the kid you speak to is the side that's going to come into the conversation with you. And I think that's how we give feedback.
What do you do when you know your child is being influenced by someone that isn't a good influence? How do you dial that back? What do you do?
It's really hard, right? And again, norms. Kids are vulnerable to norms. And so if they're hanging out with a kid or kids where things are happening that do not feel good for you as a parent, I think that what you really do need to say is, to say, like, if you're my kid who's running around and doing stuff that I don't think you should be, I think I would say something to you like, I know you, and I can't imagine this is comfortable for you. And I'm wondering if you're feeling like you're in a bit of a spot. Because that's the thing we have to remember about kids' social lives. Yeah. They operate in very complex networks that they can't easily extricate themselves from, right? So they may actually have a friend who they have a lot of ambivalence about, and they may be inclined, like they may be wanting to move on, but if that friend is sitting at the same lunch table with all the other kids they want to hang out with, that's a problem. If that kid has a lot of social power and distancing is going to be tricky, that's a problem. And even if your kid is like ready to move on, right, like ready for the next chapter of their friendship, story, they could end up in a lab group with that kid the next day, right? So I think as adults, we're so well-meaning when we're like, you got to stop hanging out with that kid, or you got to tell them you're not available. And like, your kid may be like, oh, I'd love to, right? But I actually don't have that kind of freedom here. And so the language I often use with kids when I think that time has come is like, how do you start to develop a polite distance, right? Or, can we, come up with something where you're not getting yourself into a jam, but also not causing new trouble? But we cannot underestimate how complex these things are for kids.
What do you think most parents of teens and tweens don't know about what is happening and going through their brain? Because, there are those moments where you don't have the patience to really talk it through.
No.
You don't have
really
the time.
don't.
Because you're going on to your next Zoom call, but a massive thing has just been dropped. Like, what should we know?
Well, and let's just rest in that for a minute, right? I mean, I think I got to be such a better clinician when I became a parent, right? I mean, like, there's just like, I really developed so much more empathy for how hard family life is, even under I enjoy excellent conditions. And I got to tell you, Irina, when it's, 7 or 8 or 9 o'clock at night and I am cooked, you know how we're just cooked at the end of the day and you're like, I'm just trying to get to Formula One and then to bed, right? Like, I love Formula One. It's a Netflix show about race car drivers. And
learning all these things about you.
yeah, no, and you're like, I'm just trying to get there. And then your kid is like, hi. And they're laying this long, painful story on you, and you're like, oh, you're like,
it happens at night. You were the one who warned me that it happens late at night.
it's hard. And
You
we're
crawl into
tired.
bed.
You're in bed, they're standing there telling you stuff. You're like, are you serious? Right? And so I had no idea before I became a parent how much kids complain about school, right? I mean, they complain about it so much, right? And so I think there's better and worse ways to handle it, but I just want to like offer like broad generic empathy. Like under ideal conditions, this is still very, very hard. And then of course, we're not always under ideal conditions. So to your question about like when kids are having a hard time, often that hard time interacts with when we are very tired, right? I think that it's important for us to appreciate that it is very stressful to be a kid. And the rule I always defer to is that change equals stress. This is something we know to be true in psychology. And kids are changing so fast. They have so much going on. Like if you put a 12-year-old next to a 17-year-old, right? I mean, these are two different species, really, at this point. And so, of course, their experience is stressful, and it's real. It's real for them. And so I think we need to really acknowledge that. And what I would say that the thing that makes this workable is that most of the time when kids are bringing us their stress, even if it seems to us small or we're very tired, most of the time all they want is empathy.
Really? Just to be heard.
Just to be heard. They do not want solutions. They do not want advice. They do not want questions. And so most of the time when you're trying to get to your TV show or you're trying to get to sleep or you're trying to like, if you are just like, honey, I am so sorry, like that stinks. First of all, I find I have the energy for that. Like that I can do. I feel like I'm being too honest, but it is a reality. And most of the time, kids are like, thank you, thank you. I think sometimes we dig our own hole, by trying to intervene. And
Because
so,
we think that's why they're here.
yep, that's not why they're there. Very rarely that's what they're looking for.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. So why don't we take one over here?
Hi, I've heard you speak before, and you speak so powerfully about what to do if you're concerned that your child's going to hurt themselves or even kill themselves, or if a child suspects that of a friend. And I was just like, in light of the heartache that we've had in this community, I was just hoping that you could touch on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up. And I know your community's been through a very hard time, and I'm so sorry about that. There is no way to be a parent right now and not have this fear, right? Whether or not it's touched your community, it's in the headlines, and of course, it's the most frightening thing. What I will tell you is that we've studied this a long time, and if you have any concern about your kid's safety, right, if this crosses your mind, what we say as psychologists is that the best thing to do is to actually just ask your kid. And the way I would have people do it is I would have you say to your kid, listen, this may seem a little bit out of the blue, but because of, and you have to give them a reason. Like you can't just sort of randomly ask. You have to say because you have not seemed like yourself, or because you've been in your room for a day and a half, or because you were so upset about that thing. I need to ask, have you had any thoughts of harming yourself or ending your life? Just ask. Now, the reason that adults don't ask is they worry they're going to give their kid the idea. That's not how this works. We know that. We also know from our research that if a teenager is thinking about harming themselves, they're glad you asked. So this is the thing to do if this concern comes up. To take it a bit further, teenagers also sometimes say scary things. They'll say like, I don't want to be here anymore, or like, I could just kill myself. I mean, they will just say those kinds of things, which of course is terrifying as a parent. If that happens, what I generally advise people to do is to say to your kid, okay, I heard that, and I need to ask, is that something you're really thinking about, or is that how upset you are right now? Most of the time, kids will be like, no, I don't mean it like that. I'm just super upset. Okay, then you go down the super upset road with them. But you need to check. Then, of course, there's the other piece you brought up, which is teenagers know a lot about one another. And teenagers often know long before adults do about who is struggling. And what I would say as like a really, like a sort of a generic advice is I would have you say to your kids, and you're not gonna have to remember these, I'll tell you where to find them. Say to your kids by the time they're in high school for sure, listen, you and your friends are going to talk about a lot of things. You're going to take very good care of each other. That's really important. There are 5 things that if you know about them in yourself or someone else, an adult needs to know. So depression/suicidality, self-harm, eating disordered behavior, very risky behavior. And what I mean is like teenagers take risks, that's their nature. They're kids who are so risky they scare other teenagers. And kids know exactly what you're talking about when you say that. And then actually dangerous relationships. Sometimes kids are in those. And what I say to teenagers when I tell them that list, and I'll tell you where to find it, is I say, look, this isn't because you're teenagers and we're adults. This is actually because these need to be addressed by adults with specialized training, right? So you need to help us get yourself or your friend to a specialist. Kids are usually very relieved to hear that. And so on my website, which is drlisadamore.com, if you go to the How Can I Help menu, there are 6 downloadable bookmarks.
They're really good. They're really good. Yeah.
And one of them is called When a Teenager's Friend is in Crisis. It's got these 5 at the bottom, and it also has the script, if your kid comes to you, for how to handle it, because you're gonna be very anxious when they do. And what we wanna do is we wanna handle this in a way that they're not sorry they came forward. So when I think about community safety, and I think about how we go forward, like I think a piece of that is helping teenagers feel comfortable, letting us know when they're worried about themselves or a peer.
I have to say, season 2, we did episode 79, which was on suicide, and it really was born out of the suicides here.
Yeah.
I've never told many people this, but it was because of what happened here. My first question as a parent was, is this contagion? And we had Dr. Jonathan B. Singer, who said he had a very specific response to that.
He was very helpful. So Jonathan Singer is one of my dear colleagues and one of the leading specialists, and he talked about how do we go forward in a way that keeps kids safer, doesn't make things more worrisome. And a lot of it is the adults handling it well, talking about it carefully. So there's, the nice thing about our podcast is that we can, touch on things in brief here, but I think that's a whole 40-minute episode. It's an unusually long one. So if this is something that's on your mind, like it's there and it's waiting for you.
Yeah, but that's a great question. Thank you so much for that.
Last question, no pressure.
Thank you for being here tonight. We learned a lot, and especially about texting. There's an app out there that says Rethink, so we download it on my kid's phone, and before they say anything mean, it tells them to rethink about it. So for all the parents here, if they're interested. You talked about mental health, and so a lot of our kids called us old school because they're, the new generation, and they tune you out and they keep asking, but why? But why I have to go to sleep at 10 o'clock? Why do we do that? And school is not the same. I think we have tried to change a lot of things with the new generation, but we're still teaching the old school versus the new generation. And we have millions of books about parenting, about a lot of stuff, but what can we do to our kids to help them in school? Like, we're having this session and we're being taught how to handle our kids. How about or teach our kids how to handle, adults? That's not existing in our school unless we go outside to a therapist and, and all that stuff. So how can we help our kids not to tune us out and help, why? They keep asking, but why do I have to go do this? How do we handle that?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So it's actually an incredibly perfect question to end on, because it's like you're asking big questions about how do we raise the kids we want to raise, right? And how do we send kids out into the world who thrive and also are contributing and making the world a better place. And what I can tell you is both in school and at home, there are 2 things actually kids really need. And we've studied this for a long, long time. And it's warmth and structure. And they need them both. So warmth, our kids know we love them. They also want to feel like we like them, right? And I think we need to go out of our way to enjoy our kids, have fun with them, share interests, which also sometimes means doing the things they want to do more than the things we want to do, and it's worth it. And then kids need structure. They actually need predictable rules. They need to go to bed, right? They can be cranky with us about it. They need to know that life unfolds in predictable patterns, that choices are connected to consequences. And I think one of the hardest things in parenting is that these actually are in tension with each other, right? Mm-hmm. That sometimes warmth is like, okay, fine, stay up late, right? And sometimes structure is like, no, you gotta go to bed. And so the way I think about it in my own parenting is you're never gonna get an A on both of these at the same time, right? Like I'm going for a B- average, right? Like across both. And the beautiful thing about kids is they are resilient, they bend towards health. If we can bring enough warmth and enough structure on a regular basis, they usually come out great.
Well, that is a happy, positive note to end on. Before we wrap up, I just want to really thank Patty Drarius here over there. Just amazing. You reached out a year ago to get this, and this is now one of the final events on Lisa's book tour. We're so grateful you could come out too. I want to thank Lorraine Collins also, who the two of them have been so wonderful. And Courtney, thank you so much for that generous introduction at the beginning. And thank you to all of you. You guys are truly the reason we do the podcast, is because there are parents who just want to get it right, just want to get it right. So thank you, my friend, for coming out and making the trip. We're so grateful.